Hello and welcome to Nana's Crafty Home. My name is Tanya and today I'm going to be showing you how to complete my pattern that you can find on my website. It's a free pattern. It's called the Curly Cute Cowl and it's made with the Lion brand mandala yarn. And I wanted to talk a little bit about cake choice in case you haven't decided which cake you're going to be making this pattern with. I usually pull from the center of the cake if possible and work my way out, but this technique works whether you pull from the center or from the outside of the cake. What you're wanting to look for is a cake that has the same color on the end from the inside, as well as the end on the outside, because it's much easier to disguise that seam if you are working in the same color at the end of your cowl as what you started with. So that's just a neat little tip for you in choosing your cake. Today I'm choosing to make my pattern in the Sphinx color, which is one of my favorites. I will tell you, if you are deciding to use a different yarn, you're going to want to adjust your pattern if you want the same size cowl as mine, because the mandala yarn is a weight 3. It is smaller than a weight 4, like your Karen cakes would be. Of course, if you wanted it to be large than the mandala Curly Cute that I did for my website, go ahead and just keep the pattern the same. You will more than likely need to adjust how many cakes that you will need to use for that, as the yardage will also be different. So just want to have you keep that in mind when you're making yarn choices as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start my cowl. All right, so with your yarn on your hook, and I have my hook here, size H, 5.0 millimeter hook. I will also tell you a couple of notes before we start. Just remember that we're working in the back loop only, and I do have a video tutorial on working in the back loops only for you if you need some help with that. The chain 2 at the beginning of every round does not count as a stitch. And I'm going to start here with a chain of 92. Alright, so I've completed 92 chains, and what I will be doing now is working a double crochet in the 3rd chain from the hook and then in each stitch across to the end, which will give me 90 stitches at the end, because remember, the chain 2 at the beginning does not count as a stitch. So I am working that double crochet in the 3rd chain from the hook. Alright, so I have completed my 90 double crochets. This is a good time for you to make sure that your stitch count is correct. And once you've done that row, you're going to turn your work, and then you're going to chain 2. And we're going to work in the back loops only. And as I said previously, if you have any questions about that technique and the placement of that stitch, please see my, I have another tutorial for that, but I'm just going to go ahead and continue on with my pattern. You're going to double crochet in the back loop only in the same stitch, and you're going to do a double crochet and then the next 74 for a total of 75 double crochets for this row, because again, that chain 2 does not count as a stitch. And you will leave the last 15 stitches of the previous round, the row, unworked. And that gives it that funky little tab that becomes a curly Q. All right, so I've completed a total of 75 double crochets, and you can see here that I have left the last 15 double crochets unworked at the end of my row from the previous row. So those are just going to hang off my work here. That gives it that great curly Q appearance. And so what we're going to do is row 3, and I'm going to turn my work first and chain 2. And working in the back loops only, I'm going to double crochet in the same stitch and then in each stitch until the end. And when I get to the end of this row, after my last double crochet, I'm going to chain 17. All right, so I've reached the end of that row, having completed a total of 75 stitches. And at the end of that row, I am going to complete 17 chains. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And then I'm going to turn my work to do row 4. And I'm going to start row 4 in the chains that I just did at the end of row 3. All right, so I'm going to start row 4 and I'm going to double crochet in that third chain from the hook. So 1, 2, 3. And again, as we discussed before, that chain 2 at the beginning there is not going to count as a stitch. So I'm going to work in each of the rest of these chains till I get back to the main body of my cowl. And this will just stick out again as another one of those little tabs. All right, so I've worked 15 total stitches into that 17 chains, and I'm back to the main body of my work here, and I will continue working that row, working a double crochet in the next 75 stitches in the back loops only. All right, so I've reached the end of that row, row 4, and once I get to the end of row 4, instead of turning right now, I'm going to go ahead and do another 17 chains at the end here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. and then I will turn my work to row 5. And row 5 is going to be, again, that same thing that we just did, which is double crochet in the 3rd chain from the hook. So 1, 2, 3. And each chain to the end, back to our main body of the cowl. And once I am back to the main body of my work, I will then work in the back loops only, and I will double crochet in the next 75, and I will leave the last 15 stitches unworked. All right, so I've reached the end of row 5, and I am leaving the last 15 stitches unworked, leaving that tab hanging off there. All right, so you can see here the main body is taking shape, and one of the tricks or tips or thoughts to get in your head when you're making this pattern, which I think helps get that repetition into your brain so you don't have to watch the pattern as often, is to think about the main body of this pattern. The cowl is always going to have 75 stitches in the main body. You may work up to 90, but when you're working up to 90, you're working up to 90 with the tabs that hang off on either side of the main body. So that main body of your cowl right here is never going to be more than 75 stitches. And you're just going to alternate rounds. Well, really, you're going to start going back to row 2, and you're going to do 2, 3, 4, and 5 again until you have almost run out of yarn. And that's going to depend on the yardage in your cake, because I will tell you that I have had some differences in some of the cakes that I have made into the Curly Cute. And in fact, even in some of my other patterns, I've noticed that there is a difference in yardage, even with the same gauge. So you will get different amount of rows, number of rows, and that's why in my pattern I don't tell you a specific number of rows to go to. 2 of my patterns have come out, one with 61 rows and one with 67, which is a pretty big difference. They just sit a little bit differently on the neck. They're just a little bit longer. So anyway, that is that for the first 5 rows, and you, as I said, you're going to be continuing on doing rows 2, 3, 4, and 5 in order again. And row 2, what would happen here is you would turn your work and go ahead and chain 2 and do your back loop only, double crocheting in the same stitch and in the next 74 stitches, leaving these last, leaving that tab unworked. So you'll turn here. And you're just going to keep repeating that 2, 3, 4, and 5 pattern until you almost run out of yarn. You'll want enough yarn to seam your cowl together. I'm going to go finish this cowl, and when I return, we will talk about how to seam this cowl together. All right, so I have come back with my completed curly cowl here, and you can see I have just a very little bit of yarn left over after completing my final row, and there isn't enough here actually to do another row. So I have finished. Now this is where you're going to want to look at your cowl before you completely fasten off, and see if the way that it ended up in the pattern is going to be something you're going to be happy with once you seam it and put it together. So let's take a look at mine here. So I used up as much of the yarn as I could, and what ended up happening is here's my beginning portion and here's my ending portion. And as you can see here, of course, that first row has your tab or your curly hanging off, and my end here, I ended up with a row in between, so I think that's fine. It's a little bit closer than what it would be normally, but I don't think it's anything to be concerned with or will be even that noticeable once I've sewed this together. And the opposite side here, the front rounds, I have you know, a couple of rows here, my normal amount of rows, and I do have a couple of extra. So it will be a couple of extra tabless rows on this side, but again, I don't think this is going to be a big issue for me, so I'm happy with that. It uses up the majority without wasting my cake, and yet will still not be that noticeable when I go to sew it together. Now this is quite a bit of yarn to have to sew with, so generally a good rule of thumb that I generally go by is to take your yarn and do basically what I do is I take it and I run it to where my seam is starting to where it's going to end, and I double it up back, and then I just cut. That's a pretty good rule of thumb for me. So I have the cowl here facing, this is the beginning first row that I started. And as I explained in my pattern, that first row is actually your right side. And I have that facing towards me. So this is the right side of the cowl facing towards me. And we're going to sew that seam from the right side, working our seamed stitches from the wrong side of the cowl. Alright, so once I have decided where my stitches match up, and again leaving that tab hanging off and counting those 15 stitches in, this is where those stitches are directly across from each other, where I'm going to want to seam this cowl together. What I did is I placed a stitch marker so I would not lose those 2 stitches when I'm preparing to sew that seam. And then the other note I wanted to make about this is that since I really do want to have a seamless seam, I don't want to be able to tell where my seam is at. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be picking up from that first row, that unused loop from that beginning chain from my first row, and on the opposite side, which is the ending row of my cowl, of course we have the 2 loops at the top. And what I'm going to do, since this is the front side of my cowl that I'm working towards, I have the right sides together, so this is going to show out. I really want to have another ridge, which will help this stay seamless. And the way I'm going to do that is by picking up the 1 unused loop from my beginning chain, and then I'm going to use the back loop only on the opposite side rather than going through both of those loops, and that will pull that unused front loop out and forward just the same as if I were doing a back loop only stitch double crochet. So I am working from underneath, from the wrong side, going upward into these stitches, and the first thing I'm going to do is the unused loop from that first row, and then I'm going to, again, working from underneath, so I'm taking my needle and going from underneath, and I'm only going to pick up, and I want to have you see that, I'm only going to be picking up the back loop of that ending row, and this will be, there we go, and again working from underneath the next stitch on the opposite side, and then the back loop only on the opposite. And I'm just going to continue repeating this throughout this whole row. Just going back and forth, making sure you're working on the opposite side, directly opposite, so you're not missing any of your stitches. And pull it to where it's together, but don't pull. You know, you don't want the stitches to be pulled as you're working in them. You just want a nice, even seam that's not going to bunch your work, but that will keep it nicely together. And again, you can see here, I'm only picking up that back loop. And so when I pull this apart, you can see here it's ridging up just like it does for these other rows. See here, it's nicely ridged and ridged. You can't tell a difference, and yet that's a seamed row. So this is exactly how I'm going to want to continue working this seam all the way down. And as you can see here, since I started at the right place and I worked my stitches evenly across, I am matching up my end very well. So I'll just place a stitch here, the end through both. And there we go. We matched up our ends really well. That's very nice and even there. And the trick that I gave you with doubling up to see how much yarn you would need to do the seam worked really well. I have plenty here for weaving in my end. And then when I look back at this seam, since I worked in the back loop only as I was joining the two seams together, it gave us this nice ridge, and it's really invisible. You really cannot tell just looking at it where I've seamed it, because it gave us the same ridged appearance as my other rows. So there you have it. There is your completed cowl. You'll just need to weave in your few ends that you will have, and you will be all set to go to wear your cowl. So I hope this was helpful for you today. Please visit me at nanascraftyhome.com. Make sure and remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you found this helpful. You can also find me on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.